The telegram arrived on the worst day of Garrett Morrison's life, though he wouldn't realize until later that it might also be the beginning of his salvation. He stood in the dusty main street of Fort Garland, Colorado, holding the crumpled paper in one calloused hand while his 7 children waited in the wagon behind him, their faces still streaked with tears from their mother's funeral that morning. It was May of 1878, and the spring wind carried the scent of pine from the nearby mountains, but all Garrett could smell was the fresh-turned earth of Sarah's grave. "Papa, I'm hungry," whimpered 4-year-old Lucy, the youngest of his brood. Her voice cut through his fog of grief like a knife. Garrett turned to look at them, truly look at them. For the first time since Sarah had died 3 days ago, from the fever that had swept through Fort Garland like a plague. 10-year-old Benjamin sat in the driver's seat, trying to look brave but failing. 9-year-old Rebecca held baby Thomas, who was only 18 months old and kept reaching for his mother, who would never hold him again. The twins, Daniel and David, both 7 years old, sat quietly in the back, their identical faces pale and frightened. And then there was 8-year-old Emma, who had barely spoken since watching her mother take her last breath. "I know, sweetheart," Garrett said, his voice rough. "We'll get something soon." But that was a lie, and he knew it. The telegram in his hand was from the bank in Denver, informing him that the loan on his ranch was being called in. Sarah's illness had cost them every penny they had, and now the bank wanted their pound of flesh. He had 30 days to come up with $300 or lose everything. He climbed back onto the wagon, taking the reins from Benjamin. The boy's hands were shaking. Garrett wanted to say something comforting, something fatherly and wise, but his mind was empty. He had 7 children to feed, clothe, and raise, and he had no idea how he was going to do it alone. The Morrison Ranch sat 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising majestically to the east. It was good land, fertile and well-watered, but it took constant work to maintain. Sarah had been his partner in every sense of the word, not just tending to the children, but helping with the animals, the garden, the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Without her, he was already drowning. As they pulled up to the modest wooden house, Garrett saw the pile of unwashed laundry on the porch, the weeds overtaking Sarah's vegetable garden, the chicken coop door hanging open where he'd forgotten to latch it that morning. 3 chickens had escaped, and God knew if the fox had gotten them. "Benjamin, take your brothers and gather up those chickens," Garrett said, climbing down from the wagon. "Rebecca, you and Emma see to the baby and get something started for supper." "Papa, there's not much left in the pantry," Rebecca said quietly. At 9 years old, she was already showing signs of becoming the practical, capable woman her mother had been. Garrett closed his eyes. "Do what you can." The children scattered to their tasks, and Garrett stood alone in the yard, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He was 32 years old, a widower with 7 children and a failing ranch. He had no family to turn to. His parents were long dead, and Sarah's folks had passed before Thomas was even born. The neighbors were kind but had their own struggles. This was 1878 in the Colorado Territory, and life was hard for everyone. He went into the barn to tend the horses and found himself sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands, finally letting the tears come. He cried for Sarah, for the life they'd built together, for the future they'd never have. He cried for his children, who deserved so much better than a broken father and an uncertain future. And he cried for himself, for the impossible situation he found himself in. "Papa?" Garrett looked up to see Benjamin standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the evening light. The boy looked so much like Garrett had at that age, all long limbs and serious eyes. "What is it, son? Are we going to be all right?" Garrett wanted to lie, to reassure him, but Benjamin was old enough to deserve the truth. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we are." Benjamin nodded slowly, then turned and walked back to the house. Garrett watched him go, feeling like he'd failed already. The next morning, Garrett left the older children in charge and rode into Fort Garland. The town was small but growing, with a fort that had been established 20 years earlier to protect settlers from conflicts with the local Ute tribe. Those conflicts had mostly settled now, and the fort was more of a trading post than a military installation. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, a boarding house, and a few other establishments. Garrett went to the church first, hoping to speak with Reverend Patterson. The Reverend was a good man, nearly 60 years old, with a white beard and kind eyes. He'd presided over Sarah's funeral with genuine compassion. "Garrett, my boy," the Reverend said, ushering him into the small office behind the sanctuary. "How are you holding up?" "Not well, Reverend," Garrett admitted. "I need help, and I don't know where else to turn." He explained the situation, the telegram from the bank, the impossible task of running the ranch and caring for 7 children alone. Reverend Patterson listened carefully, his brow furrowed with concern. "I wish I could help financially," the Reverend said, "but the church coffers are nearly empty. We've been helping the families affected by the fever, and there have been so many. But perhaps there's another solution. Have you thought about hiring someone to help with the children?" "I can't afford to hire anyone," Garrett said bitterly. "I can barely afford to feed them." "What about a housekeeper? There are women in town who might be willing to work for room and board, just until you get back on your feet." Garrett hadn't thought of that. "Do you know anyone who might be interested?" The Reverend stroked his beard thoughtfully. "There's a young woman who arrived in town last week. She's been staying at the boarding house, but Mrs. Henderson mentioned she's running out of money. I don't know much about her, but she seems respectable. Her name is Margaret Garrett, I believe." The coincidence of the name struck Garrett, but he pushed the thought aside. "Where can I find her?" "Try the boarding house. If she's not there, Mrs. Henderson will know where she's gone." Garrett thanked the Reverend and headed to the boarding house, a 2-story structure at the end of Main Street. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, answered his knock. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her expression softening. "I was so sorry to hear about Sarah. She was a lovely woman." "Thank you, madam. I'm looking for a Miss Margaret Garrett. I understand she's staying here?" "She is, poor thing. Let me see if she's available." Mrs. Henderson disappeared inside, leaving Garrett standing on the porch. A few minutes later, a young woman appeared in the doorway, and Garrett felt his breath catch. She was tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a plain gray dress that had seen better days, and there was a weariness about her that he recognized, the look of someone who'd been through hard times. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Henderson said you wanted to speak with me." "Yes, madam. Could we talk somewhere private?" They sat in the boarding house parlor, a small room with faded wallpaper and mismatched furniture. Margaret Garrett folded her hands in her lap and waited for him to speak. Garrett cleared his throat. "Reverend Patterson told me you might be looking for work. I have a proposition, though it's not conventional." "I'm listening," she said. "My wife passed away 3 days ago," Garrett began, and saw sympathy flash across her face. "I have 7 children, ranging from 18 months to 10 years old. I'm trying to keep our ranch running, but I can't do it alone. I need someone to help with the children, the housework, the cooking. I can't pay wages, but I can offer room and board, and a share of whatever crops we bring in this season." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those gray eyes. 7 children, she said finally. "That's a lot." "It is," Garrett admitted. "I won't lie to you. It would be hard work, but you'd have a roof over your head and food on the table." "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me." "Because you're here, and you need help, and so do I. The Reverend said you were respectable, and that's good enough for me, but I should know something about you. Where are you from? Why are you in Fort Garland?" Margaret's expression grew guarded. "I'm from Pennsylvania originally. I came west with my husband 2 years ago, looking for a better life. He died last winter in a mining accident near Leadville. I've been making my way since then, taking whatever work I could find. I came to Fort Garland because I heard there might be opportunities here, but I haven't found anything yet. My money is running out and Mrs. Henderson has been kind, but I can't stay here much longer without being able to pay." "I'm sorry about your husband," Garrett said, and meant it. "Thank you. I'm sorry about your wife." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people bound by grief and desperation. "How old are you?" Garrett asked. "If you don't mind my asking." 23, Margaret said. "And you?" 32. Margaret nodded slowly, then looked directly at him. "Mr. Morrison, I need to be honest with you. I've never had children of my own. I helped raise my younger siblings back in Pennsylvania, but 7 children is more than I've ever dealt with. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. I'm strong and I'm not afraid of hard work, but I can't promise I'll be perfect at this." "I'm not looking for perfect," Garrett said. "I'm looking for help. My children are good kids, but they're hurting right now. They need someone who can give them stability while I try to save our home. If you're willing to try, I'm willing to take a chance on you." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. Garrett could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the windowsill. She was at a crossroads, and he knew it. Whatever she decided in the next few minutes would change both their lives. Finally, she turned back to him. "I can help you with them all," she said. "All 7. When do you want me to start?" Relief washed over Garrett like a wave. "Can you be ready tomorrow morning? I'll come fetch you at first light." "I'll be ready," Margaret said. They shook hands, her grip firm and warm, and Garrett felt a tiny spark of hope kindle in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the mountains painted pink by the rising sun. Garrett left the children eating a breakfast of cold cornbread and milk, promising he'd be back soon with help. He drove the wagon into town, his heart pounding with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. What if she'd changed her mind? What if this was a terrible mistake? But Margaret was waiting on the boarding house porch, a small carpet bag at her feet. She wore the same gray dress, and her dark hair was covered by a simple bonnet. When she saw him, she picked up her bag and walked to the wagon without hesitation. "That's all you have?" Garrett asked, surprised. "I travel light," Margaret said. "Lost most everything when my husband died. What I have now fits in this bag." Garrett helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they set off toward the ranch. The morning was quiet except for the creak of the wagon wheels and the clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Garrett didn't know what to say, and apparently neither did Margaret. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, but not entirely awkward either. "Tell me about your children," Margaret said finally. "I should know what I'm getting into." Garrett felt himself relax slightly. This was solid ground, something he could talk about. "Benjamin's the oldest, just turned 10. He's serious and responsible, maybe too much so for his age. He's been trying to take care of everyone since Sarah got sick. Rebecca is 9, practical and smart. Emma's 8, but she's barely talked since her mother died. The twins Daniel and David are 7. They're identical, but Daniel has a small scar above his left eyebrow from when he fell out of a tree last summer. That's the only way to tell them apart. Lucy is 4, sweet as can be, but she cries a lot. And Thomas is the baby, 18 months. He's just starting to walk and get into everything." "That's quite a range," Margaret said. "The baby will need the most attention, obviously. Does he still nurse?" Garrett felt his face heat. "No. Sarah weaned him a few months ago. He drinks cow's milk now and eats soft foods." "That's good. What about schooling?" "Benjamin and Rebecca have been going to the school in town when they can. The others are too young yet, except maybe Emma, but with everything that's happened, I haven't thought about it much." "We should keep them in school," Margaret said firmly. "Education is important. I can manage the younger ones during the day while the older ones are learning." Garrett glanced at her, surprised by her decisiveness. "You really did help raise your siblings, didn't you?" A small smile touched Margaret's lips. 4 of them. I was the oldest. My mother died when I was 12, so I took over running the household until I married at 21. "That's young to carry such a burden," Garrett said. "No younger than many others. Life doesn't wait until you're ready." They fell silent again, but it was easier this time. Garrett found himself studying her from the corner of his eye. In the morning light, he could see that she was pretty, though she clearly hadn't had the luxury of vanity in a long time. There were shadows under her eyes and a thinness to her face that spoke of missed meals. Her hands, folded in her lap, were work-roughened and capable. When they pulled up to the ranch, Garrett saw his children lined up on the porch like a row of nervous birds. Benjamin had clearly made them all wash their faces and comb their hair. The sight made Garrett's throat tight with emotion. His boy was trying so hard to hold everything together. "Children, this is Miss Margaret Garrett," Garrett said, helping her down from the wagon. "She's going to be staying with us and helping take care of things. I expect you to treat her with respect and do as she says." 7 pairs of eyes stared at Margaret with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and hope. Margaret looked back at them calmly, not smiling but not frowning either. She set down her carpetbag and walked up the porch steps. "I'm pleased to meet you all," she said. "Your father has told me a little about each of you, but I'd like you to tell me yourselves. Will you help me with that?" Benjamin stepped forward, assuming his role as the oldest. "I'm Benjamin. This is Rebecca, Emma, Daniel, David, Lucy, and Thomas." He pointed to each sibling in turn. "Thank you, Benjamin. It's nice to meet you." Margaret looked at each child, and Garrett could see her taking in details, assessing, thinking. "I know this is strange and probably a little scary. I'm not here to replace your mother. No one could do that. But I am here to help your father and to take care of you as best I can. I'll need your help too. We'll all have to work together. Can we try that?" Slowly, Benjamin nodded. Rebecca did too, and then the others followed suit, even little Lucy, though Garrett doubted she fully understood what was happening. "Good," Margaret said. "Now, may I see the inside of the house? I'd like to get settled and figure out where everything is." Garrett showed her through the house, acutely aware of the dust, the clutter, the general air of neglect that had crept in over the past weeks. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace and a rough wooden table. There were 2 bedrooms off the main room. The larger one had been his and Sarah's, with a cradle for Thomas. The smaller one was crammed with beds for the other 6 children. "Where did you plan for me to sleep?" Margaret asked practically. Garrett felt his face heat again. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "I suppose you could take the main bedroom. I can move into the children's room, or maybe set up something in the loft above the barn." Margaret shook her head. "That's foolish. You need proper rest if you're going to work the ranch. I'll sleep in with the girls. We can rearrange the beds to make room." "That wouldn't be comfortable for you," Garrett protested. "Comfort is a luxury neither of us can afford right now," Margaret said bluntly. "Let's be practical, Mr. Morrison. We have limited resources and limited space. We make do with what we have." Garrett found himself nodding, a little awed by her directness. Sarah had been gentle and diplomatic, always softening the edges of hard truths. Margaret was different, straightforward and matter of fact. It wasn't better or worse, just different. Margaret set to work immediately, enlisting the children's help in reorganizing the sleeping arrangements, taking stock of the pantry, and making a list of what needed to be done. Garrett left them to it and went out to work on fixing the fence in the north pasture, but he found his mind wandering back to the house, wondering how Margaret was managing. When he came in for the midday meal, he found the table set with bowls of beans and cornbread. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and plentiful. The children were seated and waiting, and Margaret stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from the heat. "I hope beans are all right," she said. "I found some in the pantry and got them soaking early this morning before I left the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson let me use her kitchen." "Beans are fine," Garrett said, taking his seat. "Better than fine." They ate together, the children chattering nervously, trying to fill the silence. Margaret asked them questions about their chores, their favorite games, what they liked to eat. Garrett watched her carefully draw out even quiet Emma, who eventually admitted she liked to draw pictures with charcoal. After the meal, Margaret shooed Garrett back outside. "You have work to do, and so do I. We'll manage here." The afternoon passed in a blur of physical labor. Garrett repaired fences, checked on the cattle, cleaned out the barn. It felt good to work, to focus on something concrete rather than the swirling chaos of his emotions. But as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, anxiety crept back in. How had Margaret fared? Had the children driven her away already? When he returned to the house as twilight fell, he found a scene of domestic tranquility that made his heart ache. Margaret sat in Sarah's rocking chair, holding Thomas on her lap, while she read to the other children from a worn Bible. The lamplight made her face glow, and the children were arranged around her like flowers around the sun. Lucy had fallen asleep against her side, and even the twins were quiet and attentive. Margaret looked up as he entered, and their eyes met. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared burden and shared purpose. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was a connection nonetheless. "Papa!" Lucy woke up and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. Garrett scooped her up, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her little body. "Did you all behave for Miss Margaret?" he asked. "We did," Benjamin said. "She taught us a song after we finished our chores." "Is that so?" Garrett looked at Margaret with surprise. "Just an old hymn I learned as a child," Margaret said, standing up with Thomas balanced on her hip. The baby reached toward Garrett, and he took him, feeling the familiar weight settle against his chest. "Supper is ready whenever you are. I made stew from the salt pork I found in the cellar." They ate together again, and this time the conversation flowed more easily. The children were getting used to Margaret's presence, and she seemed more comfortable with them. After supper, she supervised while the older children helped with dishes and the younger ones got ready for bed. Garrett watched from his chair by the fire, marveling at how smoothly she managed it all. When the children were finally settled in bed, Margaret came back to the main room and sank into the rocking chair with a sigh. "They're good children," she said. "You and your wife did well with them." "Thank you," Garrett said quietly. "And thank you for today. I know it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't easy, but I've done harder," Margaret said. She looked at him across the firelit room. "Mr. Morrison, we should discuss the practical arrangements. I'll need to know about your finances, what resources we have, what the priorities are, and we should establish some ground rules about how we're going to manage this household." Garrett nodded slowly. "You're right, but first, since we're going to be living under the same roof, maybe we should use first names. I'm Garrett." "Margaret," she said. "Or Maggie if you prefer. My father used to call me Maggie. Which do you like better?" She considered. "Maggie. Margaret always sounded too formal to me." "All right then, Maggie." Garrett found he liked the sound of it. "Let me tell you about our situation." He explained everything: the debt to the bank, the 30 days he had to come up with $300, the struggles with keeping the ranch running. Maggie listened without interrupting, her face serious in the firelight. $300 in 30 days is a lot," she said when he finished. "What are your options?" "I have cattle I could sell, but not enough to raise that kind of money. I could try to get a loan from someone in town, but I don't know who'd be willing. The crops won't be ready to harvest for months." "What about taking on extra work? Is there anything you could do in town?" "Not without neglecting the ranch, which would just make things worse in the long run." Maggie was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I have a little money left, about $20. It's not much, but it's yours if it helps." Garrett was moved by the offer, but he shook his head. "I can't take your money, Maggie. You need that for yourself." "What do I need it for? You're providing room and board. I'm better off here than I was at the boarding house, and at least here I can be useful. $20 isn't going to change my life, but it might help save yours." "It's generous, but $20 won't be enough to make a difference to the bank," Garrett said. "I need to come up with a real solution." They talked late into the night, examining possibilities, making plans. By the time Maggie finally retired to the children's room, Garrett felt no closer to a solution, but he felt less alone. Having someone to share the burden with, even just to talk things through, made it feel slightly more bearable. The days fell into a rhythm. Garrett worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, while Maggie managed the household and children. She proved to be everything she'd claimed: a good cook, an efficient housekeeper, and surprisingly patient with the children. She taught Rebecca to bake bread, showed Emma how to tend the vegetable garden, and somehow convinced the twins that doing their chores was a game rather than a punishment. Benjamin remained watchful and slightly distant, not hostile, but not fully trusting either. Garrett understood. The boy had loved his mother fiercely and probably saw Maggie as an interloper, but even Benjamin couldn't deny that things were running more smoothly with her help. As for Garrett himself, he found his feelings toward Maggie growing more complicated. She was easy to talk to, practical and sensible, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard. Sometimes he'd come in from the fields and find her humming while she worked, or see her laughing at something one of the children said, and he'd feel a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. It felt disloyal to Sarah's memory. His wife had been gone less than 2 weeks, and here he was noticing another woman's smile, the way the lamplight caught in her dark hair, the graceful movements of her hands as she kneaded bread dough. He tried to push the feelings away, to focus on the practical aspects of their arrangement, but it was getting harder. One evening, about 10 days after Maggie's arrival, Garrett came in to find her sitting at the table with her head in her hands. The children were already in bed, and the house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. "Maggie, what's wrong?" She looked up, and he was shocked to see tears on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping at her face. "I'm being foolish." "What happened?" Garrett sat down across from her, alarmed. "Today is my wedding anniversary," Maggie said quietly. "Or it would have been. James and I were married 2 years ago today. I thought I was past the worst of the grief, but sometimes it just hits me again." Garrett understood too well. "I'm sorry. I know what that's like." "Do you ever wonder if you'll ever feel normal again?" Maggie asked. "If you'll ever wake up without that split second of forgetting they're gone, and then having to remember all over again?" Every day, Garrett said. But I think it gets easier. At least, that's what people tell me. They sat in silence for a while, two widowed people sharing their grief in the firelit quiet of a Colorado night. Tell me about James, Garrett said. If you want to. Maggie smiled through her tears. He was a dreamer, always had big plans, big ideas. That's why we came west, chasing his dream of striking it rich in the gold fields. He was charming and funny and completely impractical. I loved him desperately, but I also spent most of our marriage trying to keep us from starving because he was always off chasing the next big opportunity. Sounds like he was lucky to have you to keep him grounded. I don't know about that. Maybe if I'd been less practical, less cautious, I wouldn't have held him back. Maybe he'd have actually struck it rich if I'd just believed in him more. Or maybe you'd both have starved, Garrett said gently. You can't blame yourself for being the stable one in the relationship. Is that what you were, with Sarah? Garrett considered. No, we were partners. She was as steady as I was. We balanced each other, made each other better. I don't know how I'll ever manage without that. You're managing now, Maggie pointed out, only because you're here. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Maggie looked away first, standing up and busying herself with banking the fire. We should both get some rest, she said. Tomorrow is Sunday. Will we go to church? I hadn't thought about it, Garrett admitted. But yes, I suppose we should. The children need the normalcy, and people will talk if we don't. Maggie nodded. People will talk anyway. A widower and a widow living under the same roof. It's bound to cause gossip. Does that bother you? Not particularly. I stopped caring what people thought when I was scrubbing floors in a saloon to buy food after James died, but I don't want it to hurt your children or damage your reputation. Anyone who wants to gossip can go to hell, Garrett said, surprising himself with his vehemence. We're not doing anything wrong. We're two people helping each other survive. If the good folks of Fort Garland can't understand that, it's their problem, not ours. Maggie smiled and it transformed her face. I think that's the most worked up I've heard you get. I'm protective of what's mine, Garrett said, then realized how that sounded. I mean, the ranch, the children, and you're part of that now, part of keeping this family together. I know what you meant, Maggie said softly. Thank you, Garrett, for giving me a place to belong, even if it's temporary. Who says it's temporary? The question surprised them both. Maggie looked at him with wide eyes, and Garrett felt his heart pounding. He hadn't meant to say that, but now that the words were out, he realized they were true. He didn't want Maggie to leave, not just because she was useful, but because she belonged here, with them, with him. I should go to bed, Maggie said, breaking the tension. Good night, Garrett. Good night, Maggie. Sunday morning dawned bright and warm, promising a hot afternoon. Maggie got the children dressed in their best clothes, which mostly meant their cleanest and least patched garments. She herself wore a dark blue dress that Garrett hadn't seen before, probably her only good dress, carefully preserved in her small carpet bag. They rode to town in the wagon, the children chattering excitedly about seeing their friends at church. Garrett found himself hyper-aware of Maggie sitting beside him on the bench, the way her shoulder occasionally brushed his when the wagon hit a bump. He told himself to stop being ridiculous, but his body didn't seem to be listening. At the church, they were greeted with a mixture of warmth and curiosity. Reverend Patterson welcomed them kindly, and several of the women made a point of saying hello to Maggie. But Garrett could see the sideways glances, the whispered conversations behind hands. He set his jaw and ignored them, ushering his family into their usual pew. After the service, they were approached by a well-dressed man Garrett knew only slightly. Harold Fletcher owned the largest ranch in the area and had a reputation for being shrewd in business. Morrison, Fletcher said, extending his hand. I heard about your wife. My condolences. Thank you, Garrett said warily. Fletcher's eyes slid to Maggie. And this must be the young lady who's helping with your children, Margaret, isn't it? Yes, sir, Maggie said politely. I also heard you might be having some financial difficulties, Fletcher continued. The bank calling in your loan, that sort of thing. Garrett stiffened. News travels fast. It does in a small town. I wanted to make you an offer. I'm looking to expand my holdings, and your land borders mine on the west side. I'd be willing to buy you out, pay off your debt to the bank, and give you enough extra to make a fresh start somewhere else. It's a generous offer. My ranch isn't for sale, Garrett said flatly. Everything's for sale for the right price, Fletcher said with an oily smile. Think about it. You've got 7 children to think about. Wouldn't it be easier to take the money and move somewhere less demanding? Maybe a town where you could open a shop or something. This ranch was manageable when you had a wife to help. But now, he shrugged. Just think about it. Fletcher tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Garrett fuming. What an unpleasant man, Maggie said quietly. He's a vulture, Garrett said, circling, waiting for me to fail so he can pick the bones clean. Then we won't let you fail, Maggie said firmly. Come on, let's get the children home. On the ride back, Garrett found himself thinking about Fletcher's words. The man was opportunistic and cold, but he wasn't entirely wrong. The ranch was barely manageable even with Maggie's help, and the clock was ticking on the bank loan. He had less than 3 weeks now, and no solution in sight. That night, after the children were asleep, Garrett sat at the table going over his accounts for the 100th time, as if the numbers might magically change. Maggie sat across from him, mending a pair of Benjamin's trousers by lamplight. "What if we had a barn dance?" she said suddenly. Garrett looked up. "What?" "A barn dance. People do them as fundraisers sometimes, don't they? We could charge admission, maybe 50 cents a person. If we got a good turnout, it could raise some money." "A barn dance," Garrett repeated, trying to wrap his mind around it. "Here? Why not? We have a barn. We could clean it out, get someone to play music. The women from church could bring food to sell. It might not raise all $300, but it could help." Garrett thought about it. It was unconventional, maybe even desperate, but desperate was what they were. "We'd have to work fast, and I don't know if people would come." "They'll come," Maggie said confidently. "People always want a reason to celebrate, and there hasn't been much to celebrate lately with the fever and all the deaths. A dance would be good for everyone." "All right," Garrett said slowly. "Let's try it. What do we need to do?" They stayed up late planning, making lists, dividing tasks. By the time they finally went to bed, Garrett felt a cautious optimism. It might not work, but at least they were doing something. The next day, Maggie went into town and spoke with Reverend Patterson about their plan. The Reverend was enthusiastic and agreed to help spread the word. Maggie also enlisted some of the church women, who were eager to contribute. Meanwhile, Garrett and Benjamin worked on cleaning out the barn, moving equipment and hay bales to create a space suitable for dancing. The twins, Daniel and David, took on the task of making posters to hang around town, carefully copying the information in their best 7-year-old handwriting. Rebecca helped Maggie plan the refreshments, taking inventory of what they had and what they'd need to buy. Even little Lucy helped, picking wildflowers to decorate the barn. As word spread, the response was encouraging. People seemed genuinely excited about the dance. Some offered to help with preparations. Others promised to attend and bring friends. Even cranky old Mrs. Peterson from the general store said she'd come, though she added that she was too old to dance and would just watch. Garrett found a fiddler named Tom O'Brien who agreed to play in exchange for a share of the admission money. Tom was an Irishman who'd come west years ago and now made a living doing odd jobs and playing music at gatherings. He was talented and personable, and Garrett felt lucky to have him. As the day of the dance approached, the ranch became a hive of activity. Maggie baked pies and cakes, Rebecca helped prepare sandwiches, and Garrett and the boys strung lanterns in the barn. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a working barn now looked festive and welcoming, with the lanterns casting warm pools of light and wildflowers in jars scattered around. The dance was set for Saturday evening. As the sun began to set and the first guests arrived, Garrett felt his nervousness grow. What if no one came? What if this whole thing was a disaster? But people did come. They came in wagons and on horseback, dressed in their Sunday best, carrying dishes of food to share. They came from town and from neighboring ranches, families and couples, and single folk looking for entertainment. By the time Tom O'Brien struck up the first tune, the barn was crowded with people, and Garrett felt tears prick his eyes at the outpouring of community support. Maggie moved through the crowd, greeting people, making sure everyone had refreshments, collecting the admission money in a tin box. She looked beautiful tonight, Garrett realized. She'd done something different with her hair, pulling it back, but letting a few curls frame her face, and she wore her blue dress with a white shawl Sarah had made years ago. Maggie had asked permission to borrow it, and Garrett had agreed, touched that she'd asked. "You should dance," Reverend Patterson said, appearing at Garrett's elbow. It's your party, after all. I'm not much of a dancer, Garrett protested. Neither am I, but that's never stopped anyone. The Reverend gestured to the dance floor, where couples were already twirling to Tom's lively fiddle music. Besides, Miss Margaret looks like she could use a partner. Garrett looked over to see Maggie standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the dancers with a wistful expression. Before he could talk himself out of it, he walked over to her. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, feeling suddenly shy. Maggie's face lit up. "I thought you'd never ask." He led her onto the floor, very aware that people were watching them. He hadn't danced since his wedding to Sarah, and he felt clumsy and self-conscious. But Maggie was a good dancer, light on her feet, and she followed his lead easily even when he stumbled. "You're doing fine," she said, smiling up at him. "I'm stepping on your feet." "Only a little." They danced, and gradually Garrett relaxed. The music washed over him, and the warmth of Maggie's hand in his felt right somehow. He could see his children watching from the sidelines, Benjamin looking thoughtful, Rebecca smiling, the younger ones clapping along to the music. When the song ended, they broke apart, both slightly breathless. "Thank you," Garrett said. "Thank you for asking," Maggie replied. Other men came to ask Maggie to dance after that, and Garrett felt an unfamiliar twist of jealousy watching her twirl around the floor with Tom O'Brien, then with young Samuel Davis from the neighboring ranch. But Maggie kept looking back at him between dances, and that made him feel better. As the evening wore on, Garrett mingled with the guests, accepting condolences and well wishes, thanking people for coming. Harold Fletcher showed up late, looking around with a proprietary air that set Garrett's teeth on edge. "Nice turnout," Fletcher said, "though I doubt it'll raise enough to solve your problems." "We'll see," Garrett said evenly. "My offer still stands," Fletcher said. "In fact, I'll sweeten it. $3,000 for your ranch, paid in cash. That's more than fair. And I told you, it's not for sale." Fletcher shrugged. "Your loss. When the bank forecloses, they'll sell it at auction, and I'll get it for half that price. I'm trying to be generous here, Morrison." "Your generosity isn't wanted," Garrett said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to." He walked away before his temper got the better of him. He found Maggie near the refreshment table, and she took one look at his face and pulled him aside. "What did he say?" she asked. "Offered to buy the ranch again. $3,000. Maggie's eyes widened. "That's a lot of money." "It is, but the ranch is worth more than money to me. It's my children's legacy, the life Sarah and I built together. I can't just sell it off to the highest bidder." "I understand," Maggie said. "But Garrett, $3,000 would solve all your problems. You could pay the bank, have money left over, start fresh somewhere. Is that what you think I should do?" Garrett asked, searching her face. Maggie was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I think you should fight for what's yours. I think your children deserve to grow up on this land their mother loved. But I also think you need to be realistic about what you can and can't do." "I know," Garrett said tiredly. "Believe me, I know." The dance continued late into the night. When the last guests finally left and Tom O'Brien packed up his fiddle, Garrett and Maggie sat down to count the money. The children had all fallen asleep in various corners of the barn, worn out from the excitement. $143, Maggie said, stacking the coins and bills neatly. "It's more than I hoped." "It's not enough," Garrett said, though he tried to keep the disappointment out of his voice. "We're still short over $150, and we have less than 2 weeks now." "It's a start," Maggie said firmly. "We'll find the rest somehow." But as the days passed, Garrett became increasingly desperate. He sold 2 of his best cows, which brought in another $30. He took on some day labor in town, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, exhausted. Maggie sold some of Sarah's jewelry, things she'd kept safe, bringing in another $20. But it still wasn't enough. 1 week before the bank deadline, Garrett received another visit from Harold Fletcher. This time, Fletcher came to the ranch with a contract already drawn up. "I'm making this easy for you, Morrison," Fletcher said, spreading the papers on the kitchen table. "Sign here, and all your troubles are over. You keep fighting this, you're going to lose everything anyway. At least this way, you get something out of it." Garrett stared at the contract, the words blurring before his eyes. He was so tired, bone-tired from working 18-hour days and not sleeping at night, sick with worry about the future. Maybe Fletcher was right. Maybe he was being stubborn and foolish. putting pride ahead of practicality. "Don't do it," Maggie said from the doorway. Both men turned to look at her. She stood with her arms crossed, her gray eyes fierce. "This doesn't concern you, miss," Fletcher said dismissively. "It does concern me. This is my home, too." Maggie walked into the room and stood beside Garrett. "He's not signing away his children's birthright because you're a greedy man who wants more land than you already have." Fletcher's face reddened. "You've got a mouth on you, woman. Morrison, you going to let her speak to me like that?" "She's right," Garrett said, pushing the contract away. "The answer is no, Fletcher. It's been no every time you've asked, and it'll stay no. Now get off my property." Fletcher snatched up his papers, his eyes cold. "You're a fool, Morrison, and when you lose everything, don't come crying to me." After he left, Garrett slumped in his chair. "Maybe I am a fool." "You're not," Maggie said, sitting down beside him. She took his hand, and he felt the warmth of her touch spread through him. "You're brave and honorable, and you're fighting for what matters. We'll find a way." "How?" "We're out of options, Maggie. I've sold everything I can sell, worked every job I can find. We're still short over $100, and the bank won't wait. Then we go to the bank and ask for more time. Explain the situation. Show them what you've done to try to pay them. Maybe they'll extend the deadline." "Banks don't extend deadlines," Garrett said bitterly. "Maybe this one will. It's worth trying." The next morning, Garrett rode into Fort Garland and went to see Mr. Dalton, the bank manager. Dalton was a thin, precise man with spectacles and a perpetual look of disapproval. He listened to Garrett's plea with no expression. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your situation is difficult," Dalton said when Garrett finished. "But the bank has policies. This loan was already extended once when your wife was ill. We cannot extend it indefinitely." "I'm not asking for indefinitely, just another month. I have a crop coming in, cattle I can sell then. I'll pay everything I owe, with interest." Dalton steepled his fingers. "The problem is, we've already had an offer to purchase your note. Mr. Fletcher has expressed interest in buying your debt from the bank. If he does that, he'll own your loan, and I suspect he'll be less flexible than we've been." Garrett's blood ran cold. "Fletcher wants to buy my debt?" "He made the offer yesterday. I haven't accepted yet, but if you can't pay in full by the deadline, I'll have to consider it seriously." "That's what this is all about," Garrett said, realization dawning. "Fletcher can't get me to sell to him, so he's going to force me out by buying my debt and foreclosing." "I can't speak to Mr. Fletcher's motivations," Dalton said primly. "I can only tell you that the bank requires payment in full by next Friday, or we'll have to take action." Garrett left the bank feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Fletcher had him in a corner, and they both knew it. Unless a miracle happened in the next 6 days, he was going to lose everything. He rode back to the ranch in a daze. When he arrived, he found Maggie in the garden with the children, harvesting early vegetables. She took one look at his face and sent the children inside, then came to him. "What happened?" He told her everything. When he finished, Maggie was quiet, her face pale but determined. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "What about the cattle? Could you drive them to Denver now, sell them there for a better price?" "Denver's 5 days away. I'd never make it there and back in time, and I can't leave you alone with the children for that long. I can manage the children. Maggie, even if I went, there's no guarantee I'd get a good enough price. And leaving now would mean abandoning the ranch right when Fletcher is circling like a hawk." They stood there in the afternoon sun, both of them out of ideas, out of hope. Garrett felt something break inside him, all the strength he'd been holding on to crumbling away. "Maybe I should just take Fletcher's offer," he said quietly. $3,000 would give us a fresh start. The children would be provided for. "And where would we go?" Maggie asked. "What would we do?" Garrett noticed her use of "we," but he was too defeated to comment on it. "I don't know. Find a town, open a shop maybe. Benjamin's good with numbers. He could help." "And you'd be miserable," Maggie said. "You're a rancher, Garrett. This land is in your blood. You'd wither away in some shop, and you know it. Better to wither away than watch my children starve." Maggie grabbed his arms, forcing him to look at her. "We are not giving up. Do you hear me? We've come this far. We're not quitting now." "What else can we do?" Garrett said, his voice breaking. "I've tried everything, Maggie. I don't know what else to do." "Then we pray," Maggie said fiercely. "We pray for a miracle, and we keep fighting until the very last moment." That night, the whole family knelt together in the main room, and Reverend Patterson, who Maggie had asked to come, led them in prayer. Even the children seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. When the prayer was finished, Benjamin spoke up. "Papa, we could give our savings," he said. "All of us kids have been saving pennies and nickels. It's not much, but it's something." The other children nodded eagerly, even little Lucy. Garrett felt tears sting his eyes. "That's very generous, but I can't take your money." "It's family money," Rebecca said practically. "If the family needs it, that's what it's for." In the end, the children's savings added up to $3.67. It was a drop in the bucket, but Garrett was moved beyond words by their willingness to give everything they had. The next few days passed in a blur of increasingly desperate measures. Garrett sold his best horse, which broke his heart but brought in $40. Maggie went door to door in town, explaining their situation and asking if anyone could help. Some people gave a few dollars, others promised prayers. It all added up, slowly, painfully, but still not enough. By Thursday night, the night before the deadline, they were still $37 short. Garrett sat at the table, staring at the pile of money they'd scraped together, and felt numb. They'd fought so hard, and it wasn't enough. Maggie sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, Garrett. It's not your fault. You did everything you could, more than I had any right to ask." "I care about this family," Maggie said. "I care about you." Garrett looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the depth of emotion in her gray eyes. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just a practical arrangement. They'd become something more, a real partnership, maybe even something like love. "I care about you too," he said, "more than I probably should, given that Sarah's been gone less than 2 months. "Sarah would want you to be happy," Maggie said. "She'd want her children taken care of, and I think if she could see us now, she'd understand." "Maybe," Garrett said. He wanted to say more, to tell Maggie how much she'd come to mean to him, how the thought of losing not just the ranch, but her too, was breaking his heart in a different way. But before he could find the words, there was a knock at the door. Garrett opened it to find a group of people standing on his porch. Reverend Patterson, Tom O'Brien the fiddler, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, and a half-dozen others from town and neighboring ranches. "Evening, Garrett," Reverend Patterson said. "Sorry to come so late, but we heard about your situation. We took up a collection." The Reverend held out a canvas bag. Garrett took it with shaking hands and looked inside. Bills and coins more than he'd expected. "People wanted to help," Mrs. Henderson said. "We all know you're a good man who's had a run of bad luck. This community takes care of its own." Garrett counted the money right there on the porch, not quite believing what he was seeing. $38, more than enough to make up the difference. "I don't know what to say," Garrett managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll stay," Tom O'Brien said. "We need good people like you in Fort Garland." After they left, Garrett and Maggie counted all the money together one more time, just to be sure. $301, enough to pay the bank with $1 to spare. Maggie burst into tears, and Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. They stood there in the middle of the kitchen, clinging to each other, both crying and laughing at the same time. "We did it," Maggie said against his chest. "We actually did it." "You did it," Garrett corrected. "This was your idea, the dance, asking for help. I'd have given up weeks ago if not for you." Maggie pulled back to look at him, her face wet with tears but glowing with joy. "We did it together. That's how this works, isn't it? Together." "Together," Garrett agreed. And then, because it felt like the most natural thing in the world, he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, gentle and tentative, both of them still navigating the newness of what was growing between them. But when they pulled apart, Garrett saw his own feelings reflected in Maggie's eyes. Hope, affection, and the beginning of love. The next morning, Garrett rode into town with the money in his saddlebag and Maggie beside him on the wagon seat. They went to the bank together, and Garrett had the immense satisfaction of counting out $300 onto Mr. Dalton's desk. "Paid in full," Garrett said. "I'll need a receipt showing the debt is cleared." Dalton looked disappointed but professional. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Congratulations on meeting your obligation." When they left the bank, Garrett felt like he could breathe fully for the first time in months. The ranch was safe. His children's home was secure. They had a future. As they walked back to the wagon, they passed Harold Fletcher on the street. The rancher's face was dark with anger when he saw them. "Heard you scraped together the money," Fletcher said. Don't think this is over, Morrison. You're barely hanging on. One bad crop, one hard winter, and you'll be right back where you started. Maybe, Garrett said calmly. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today I've got my land, my family, and my pride. That's enough for me. Fletcher stalked off, and Maggie squeezed Garrett's arm. You handled that well. I had good reason to. I've got something worth fighting for. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The immediate crisis was over, but there was still plenty of work to do. Garrett threw himself into preparing for the harvest, repairing equipment, tending the crops. Maggie continued managing the household, but she also started helping more with the outdoor work, proving herself surprisingly capable with the animals and in the fields. The children thrived under their care. Benjamin gradually warmed to Maggie, especially after she sat him down one day and told him that she would never try to replace his mother, but she hoped they could be friends. Rebecca became Maggie's shadow, learning everything she could about running a household. Even quiet Emma started talking more, showing Maggie her drawings and helping with baby Thomas. As summer ripened into fall, the crops came in better than Garrett had dared hope. The wheat was abundant, the corn tall and strong. They harvested together, the whole family working side by side, and when they sold the crops in town, the profit was enough to see them comfortably through the winter, with some left over for savings. One evening in late September, after the children were in bed, Garrett and Maggie sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The air was getting crisp with the promise of autumn, and Garrett found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't been able to for months. Maggie, he said, I need to talk to you about something. She looked at him, her expression curious but calm. All right. When you came here 5 months ago, it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. You needed a place to stay, and I needed help. But it's become more than that, at least for me. He paused, gathering his courage. I love you, Maggie. I love your strength, your kindness, your laugh, the way you are with my children. I love how you challenge me to keep fighting when I wanted to give up. And I know it's soon. I know Sarah hasn't been gone even half a year yet, but I can't keep pretending this is just a practical arrangement. Maggie's eyes were bright with tears. I love you too, she said softly. I think I started falling for you that first day, watching you try so hard to take care of your children, even though you were drowning in grief. You're a good man, Garrett Morrison, and I would be honored to share my life with you. Then marry me, Garrett said. Make this real. Be my wife. Be a mother to my children. Not replacing Sarah, never that, but making something new with me, something that's ours. Yes, Maggie said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married in November, a quiet ceremony in the church with just family and close friends present. The children stood with them, all 7 of them, as Reverend Patterson pronounced Garrett and Maggie husband and wife. It felt right, Garrett thought, to have the children there. This wasn't just a marriage between 2 people, it was the joining of a family. Maggie wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric the church ladies had given her, a soft blue that matched her eyes. She was beautiful, and when Garrett kissed her at the end of the ceremony, he felt a completeness he'd thought he'd never know again. The first winter as a married couple was hard but happy. The snow came early and heavy, sometimes trapping them in the house for days at a time. But those days became precious. The whole family gathered around the fire while the wind howled outside, playing games, telling stories, just being together. Garrett watched Maggie with his children and marveled at how seamlessly she'd become part of their lives. She tucked them in at night, kissed their scraped knees, helped with their lessons, and loved them fiercely. And they loved her back, even calling her mother eventually, though they never forgot Sarah. In the spring, Maggie told Garrett she was pregnant. They were in the garden, planting seeds, and she said it so casually that it took him a moment to process. You're going to have a baby, he repeated, stunned. We're going to have a baby, Maggie corrected, smiling. Probably in October, if I'm calculating right. Garrett whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. The children came running to see what the commotion was about, and when they heard the news, they erupted in excited chatter. A baby! Lucy squealed. Can it be a girl? I want a sister. I hope it's a boy, David said. Then we'd have 4 boys and 4 girls, and it would be even. We don't get to choose, Rebecca said practically, but she was grinning. Either way, it'll be wonderful. That summer was one of the best of Garrett's life. The crops were good, the cattle were healthy, and his family was thriving. Maggie bloomed with pregnancy, growing round and glowing. She still worked hard, though Garrett and the children tried to take over more of her tasks. She'd have none of it, insisting she was perfectly capable of managing her usual duties. "I'm having a baby, not dying," she said, when Garrett tried to stop her from lifting a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Humor me," Garrett said, taking the basket from her. "I just want to take care of you." Maggie softened. "I know, and I love you for it, but you take care of me by treating me like I'm still capable, not like I'm fragile." It was a balance they learned together, letting Maggie do what she could while supporting her when she needed it. As fall approached and her time drew near, Garrett found himself getting nervous. He'd been through this 7 times with Sarah, but it had never gotten easier, the anxiety of waiting, hoping everything would be all right. On a crisp October evening, Maggie's labor began. Mrs. Henderson came to help, along with another woman from town who'd served as a midwife. Garrett paced in the main room while the children huddled together, trying not to look worried. The sounds from the bedroom brought back memories of Sarah, and Garrett had to fight down panic. "Papa, is Maggie going to be all right?" Benjamin asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "She's going to be fine," Garrett said, praying it was true. "Your mother was strong, and Maggie is strong too." Hours passed. Garrett wore a path in the floor with his pacing, and then, finally, he heard it, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. The bedroom door opened, and Mrs. Henderson emerged, smiling. "You have a son," she said, "a big, healthy boy, and Maggie did wonderfully. She's tired but fine." Garrett rushed into the bedroom. Maggie lay in the bed, pale and exhausted, but radiantly happy, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at Garrett with such love that it took his breath away. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Garrett approached carefully and looked down at the baby's face. He was perfect, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn gray like Maggie's. As Garrett watched, the baby yawned and made a small snuffling sound. "He's beautiful," Garrett said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're beautiful. I love you so much, Maggie." "I love you too," Maggie said. "Do you want to hold him?" Garrett took the baby carefully, cradling him against his chest, his son, his and Maggie's, a symbol of their love and their new life together. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking James," Maggie said, "after my first husband, and Samuel, after your father, James Samuel Morrison." "That's perfect," Garrett said. He looked at the tiny face of his son and felt his heart expand. He'd thought after Sarah died that he'd never be this happy again. But here he was, holding his newborn son, with a wife he loved, and 7 other children who needed him. Life was good, better than he'd dared dream. The children were allowed in to meet their new brother, and they clustered around the bed in awe. Even the twins were quiet, staring at the baby with wonder. "He's so small," Emma whispered. "You were all this small once," Maggie said, smiling at them. "Hard to believe, I know." "Can I hold him?" Rebecca asked. Garrett carefully transferred the baby to Rebecca's arms, showing her how to support his head. She looked down at James with such tenderness that Garrett felt tears prick his eyes. His daughter, who'd grown up so much in the past year, who'd taken on so many responsibilities. She deserved this moment of pure joy. One by one, the older children held the baby, each of them careful and awed. Even Lucy, with Garrett's hand steadying hers, got to hold her new brother. Baby Thomas, now almost 3 years old, seemed confused by the whole thing, but patted the baby's hand gently. That night, after everyone had finally gone to bed, Garrett sat beside Maggie and watched his youngest son sleep in the cradle beside their bed. The cradle that had held all his children at one time or another, smoothed by use and love. "Thank you," he said to Maggie, "for everything, for coming into our lives, for saving us, for loving us." "You saved me too," Maggie said. "I was lost when I came here, Garrett. I had no home, no purpose, no future. You gave me all of that." "We gave it to each other," Garrett said. He leaned over and kissed her gently. "I love you, Mrs. Morrison." "I love you too, Mr. Morrison." As the years passed, the Morrison Ranch continued to thrive. Garrett expanded his herd, bought more land, and became known as one of the most successful ranchers in the Fort Garland area. Harold Fletcher eventually moved on to easier prey, Though he never quite forgave Garrett for refusing to sell, the children grew. Benjamin became a strong, capable young man who worked the ranch alongside his father. Rebecca married at 19 to a good man from a neighboring ranch, and Garrett walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Emma discovered a talent for painting and sold her landscapes to people passing through Fort Garland. The twins, impossible to tell apart, kept everyone on their toes with their pranks, but were hard workers when it counted. Lucy grew into a spirited, cheerful girl who could ride better than most of the boys in the county. Thomas, the baby who'd never known his birth mother, grew up calling Maggie Mama and never knowing any different. And James, the son born of Garrett and Maggie's love, was a happy, curious boy who looked up to his older siblings and adored his parents. Maggie and Garrett had 2 more children in the years that followed. A daughter they named Sarah Margaret, in honor of both Garrett's first wife and Maggie, and then another son, Daniel Henry. The house was always full of noise and laughter, and though money was sometimes tight, love was abundant. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Maggie on a picnic to a hill overlooking the ranch. They sat on a blanket in the warm June sunshine, watching their children play in the yard below. Benjamin was teaching young James to ride. Rebecca had come to visit with her baby daughter. The others were scattered around, doing chores or playing, the everyday chaos of a large family. "Can you believe it's been 5 years?" Maggie said, leaning against Garrett's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like forever," Garrett said. "In the best way." "Do you think Sarah would be happy?" Maggie asked quietly. "With how things turned out?" Garrett considered the question carefully. It was something he'd thought about often over the years. "I think she'd be glad her children are loved and cared for. I think she'd be grateful to you for stepping in when they needed someone. And I think she'd want me to be happy, which I am. Very happy." "I hope so," Maggie said. "I never wanted to erase her memory." "You didn't. You added to our family. You didn't replace anything. Sarah will always be the mother of those 7 children, and they'll always remember her. But you're their mother too, in a different way. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies." Maggie smiled and kissed him. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think I'm the lucky one," Garrett said. "You saved my life, Maggie Morrison, in every way that counts." As they sat there watching their family, Garrett reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The grief and desperation, the hard work and sacrifice, the community support and answered prayers. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He'd been a desperate man with 7 children and a failing ranch, staring down the barrel of losing everything. And Maggie had been a widow with no home and no prospects, running out of options. They'd found each other at exactly the right moment, 2 broken people who'd fit together to make something whole. "What are you thinking about?" Maggie asked, seeing the distant look in his eyes. "About that day in the boarding house parlor, when you said you could help me with them all," Garrett said. 7 children must have seemed overwhelming. "It was overwhelming," Maggie admitted. "But I was desperate too. I needed a home, and you needed help. It seemed like fate." "It was fate," Garrett said firmly. "The best thing that ever happened to me, aside from my children. You gave me hope when I had none, love when I thought I'd never love again, and a future when all I could see was loss." "We gave those things to each other," Maggie said, echoing words they'd spoken years before. "That's what love is, isn't it? 2 people helping each other become better, stronger, happier." "Yes," Garrett agreed. "That's exactly what it is." Little Sarah came running up the hill then, her pigtails flying behind her. At 3 years old, she was the spitting image of her mother, with dark hair and gray eyes. "Mama, Papa, come play with us," she demanded. "All right, sweetheart," Maggie said, laughing. Garrett helped her to her feet, and they walked hand in hand down the hill toward their home and their children. As the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the Morrison family gathered on the porch for their evening meal. It was a tight fit, with 10 children now, but they made it work. They always made it work. Garrett looked around at the faces of his children, all of them healthy and happy, and at Maggie beside him, her hand resting on her stomach, where another baby was just beginning to grow. They hadn't told the children yet, but Garrett knew. He always knew. "Let's say grace," Garrett said, and they all joined hands around the table. "Dear Lord, thank you for this food, for this family, for this home. Thank you for bringing us together and seeing us through the hard times. Thank you for the blessings we have and the blessings yet to come. Amen, amen, the family chorused. As they ate and talked and laughed together, Garrett felt a deep contentment settle over him. This was what happiness looked like, not perfection, but love, not ease, but purpose, not the absence of hardship, but the presence of people to face it with. He'd lost Sarah, and that grief would always be a part of him. But he'd gained Maggie, and with her, he'd built a new life that honored the past while embracing the future. His 7 children had the mother they needed, and the 3 children he and Maggie had made together were loved just as fiercely. The ranch was prosperous, the family was healthy, and the future stretched out before them full of possibility. They would face challenges, certainly. There would be hard winters and crop failures and all the usual trials of life. But they would face them together, as a family, and that made all the difference. That night, after the children were all in bed and the house was quiet, Garrett and Maggie sat together on the porch swing he'd built for their first anniversary. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the cool night air carried the scent of pine and earth. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Garrett asked. "When I offered you the job?" "I said I could help you with them all," Maggie replied. "And I meant it." "You did more than help," Garrett said. "You saved us, all of us." "We saved each other," Maggie insisted. "Stop trying to make me into some kind of Saint Garrett Morrison. I was just a woman who needed a home and found one. You found more than a home. You found a family, and we found more than a housekeeper. We found a mother, a wife, a partner. We found you." Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder, and they swung gently in the darkness. "I love you," she said simply. "I love this life we've built. I love every moment of it, even the hard ones." "I love you too," Garrett said. "More than I ever thought I could love again." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd found each other in desperation and built something beautiful from the ashes of their losses. The ranch stood solid around them, the children slept peacefully inside, and the future waited with open arms. Garrett thought about Harold Fletcher's prediction that one bad crop or hard winter would bring him back to the edge of ruin. Maybe that was true. Life in the Colorado Territory in 1883 was still hard, still uncertain, but whatever came, they would face it together. He had Maggie by his side, his children around him, and a community that had proven they cared. He was no longer a desperate man drowning in grief and debt. He was a husband, a father, a rancher, a man with purpose and love and hope. And it had all started with a simple offer: room and board in exchange for help with 7 children. "Garrett," Maggie said, interrupting his thoughts. "Yes? I'm glad I found you. That day at the boarding house, when Mrs. Henderson said a man wanted to speak with me, I almost refused. I was so tired, so discouraged. But something made me say yes. I think it was fate bringing us together." "I think so too," Garrett agreed. "The best fate possible." They stayed on the porch until the moon rose high, talking quietly about everything and nothing. When they finally went inside, Garrett checked on each of the children, a nightly ritual he'd maintained since Sarah's death. They were all sleeping soundly, from Benjamin in his small room off the back porch to baby Daniel in his cradle beside the big bed. As Garrett climbed into bed beside Maggie, she curled into his arms with a contented sigh. "Good night, my love," she whispered. "Good night," Garrett replied, kissing her forehead. He lay awake for a while after she fell asleep, listening to her breathing and thinking about how far they'd come. From that desperate day in May of 1878, when Sarah had died, and he'd thought his world was ending, to this peaceful night in 1883, with a wife he loved and a family that was thriving. Life was good. Life was hard, but it was good. And in the morning, they would wake up and do it all again. The work, the laughter, the challenges, the love. Together, always together, the way it was meant to be. The Morrison Ranch would stand for generations, passed down through Benjamin to his children and grandchildren. The story of Garrett and Maggie would be told and retold, becoming family legend. The desperate widower with 7 children and the homeless widow who'd said she could help with them all, and how they'd fallen in love and built an empire together. But that was the future, still unwritten. For now, in this moment, all that mattered was the warmth of Maggie beside him, the sound of his children breathing in sleep, and the knowledge that against all odds, they had made it. They had survived, thrived, and found happiness in the unlikeliest of places. Garrett closed his eyes and let sleep take him, a smile on his face and peace in his heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, all was well in the Morrison household, and that was more than enough. The story that had begun in desperation had become a love story for the ages, proof that even in the hardest times, in the wildest of lands, hope and love could flourish. 7 children and 1 desperate man had found salvation in the form of a gray-eyed woman who needed a home and offered help. Together, they had built not just a home, but a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And somewhere, perhaps Sarah was smiling down on them, glad that her children were loved and her husband had found happiness again. The circle was complete, the family whole, and the future bright with promise. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for: love, family, and a home to call their own. The Wild West was a hard place, unforgiving and dangerous, but it was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where people could reinvent themselves and build lives from nothing. Garrett and Maggie had done exactly that, and in doing so, they'd proved that love could conquer even the most impossible odds. As the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood sentinel in the distance, the Morrison Ranch slept peacefully, a beacon of hope and family in the vast Colorado wilderness. And inside, 2 hearts beat as one, bound together by fate, desperation, and a love that would last a lifetime and beyond.